Today we'll be talking about chapter 42, which is on ecosystems and energy. So, in specific, we will be looking at section 1 and section 2. So, this will go through your book through about, let me just double check, about page 892. So what we're really going to focus on here in our last chapter for this year is the relationship between energy and ecosystems, and how energy usage and production can determine a lot of different things about an ecosystem. And so we already know from early on this year for the cell process, respiration, and photosynthesis where the energy comes from. So energy in an ecosystem it ultimately comes from the sun. Alright, so if we're making up a map, that's ultimately where the energy comes from, is the sun. So the sun shines and that sunlight hits a leaf of a plant maybe, and the leaf converts that energy to chemical energy. And this chemical energy that is stored in the leaf in forms of starch, in forms of glucose, like in sap, this chemical energy that is stored or harnessed in the plants is used to provide food ultimately for the whole ecosystem. So when we're talking about ecosystems and energy today, we're talking about this process. So photosynthesis is the process of converting it from the sunlight to the energy. We've already talked about this part. That is photosynthesis. We're talking about what happens here. This is the ecology part. Alright? And so the first thing that I want to point out is that ecosystems have to follow what's called the conservation of energy. So because ultimately the source of energy is the sun, and we're converting that energy from one form to the other, a lot of ecology has to do, a quantity of ecology has to do with chemistry and physics. So if we start out with some amount of energy in plants, that energy is passed on to our primary consumers, and that energy is passed on to our secondary consumers, and then to our top carnivores. And because the second law of thermodynamics says that energy can be must be conserved, but remember our second law of thermodynamics that also states that the entropy of the universe always increases, we have some waste. We have some energy loss. Conversion is inefficient, so at each step we have some energy loss. And that usually is in the form of heat. that energy loss. So each step from plants to our top carnivores, we're losing some of that energy that isn't usable back to the environment. And that is why top carnivores have much less available energy than our plants. Our plants have the most energy that's available to them, just because there's less energy loss in transforming it from one place to the other, or from one time, for one type, from one intermediate carrier, the plant, the primary, the secondary, and the top carnivore, to the other. Because in ecology, energy is recycled. We'll talk about this a little bit more next time in the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle. Energy is recycled, okay? And some energy like this is lost as it goes around and around and around in this cycle. However, by and large, much more is recycled than is lost. So it's a very small amount that's lost compared to what is being continually recycled and recycled and recycled. And this idea of energy flow and losing energy and how energy is passed through our ecosystem is where we get the idea for our trophic levels, like we talked about last time. So our ultimate source of energy is the sun, all right, and our sun provides our primary consumers. Our primary consumers, our primary producers. That is my fault. Our sun provides for our producers. Alright? And in turn, our producers are eaten by our primary consumers. And then our secondary / tertiary consumers. And all of these things are broken down by our decomposers. So energy is flowing along these arrows, and it also flows from our decomposers back to our producers, because when things die and our decomposers break them down in the soil, our producers reuse that energy. So our trophic levels are more accurately a trophic circle. It's more of a cycle. So a trophic levels, not really, it's more like a trophic cycle. They're all connected in a cyclic pattern. So hopefully that gives us a good idea of how energy is governed or cycled through the ecosystem. The last thing I want to talk about is production and limitation to energy in the ecosystem. Alright? So, at any period of time, for example, in a year, if we think about how much energy is really used by an ecosystem to grow, it's hard to measure. And that's why ecologists use something called primary production. And this is basically sun energy turned to chemical producers. So an ecosystem's primary production is the amount of sun energy turned to chemical energy by producers. And in an example, if there is an ecosystem where there's a lot of photosynthetic organisms, this might be really high. And in an area like the tundra where it's not plentiful photosynthetic organisms, that's going to be really, really, really low. All right? And we can use this to do many different important things. So let's start from the beginning, from the sun. So the sun, each day, for example, the sun provides 10 to the 22nd joules of energy each day. All right? So just think about that. 10 to the 22nd joules of energy. That's enough energy to supply the Earth for 19 years. However, about 50% of this energy, so 50% of the total amount of energy that the sun provides that hits the Earth, 50% never reaches the ground. It's scattered away by the atmosphere, absorbed in clouds, different things. Only a small fraction actually reaches the ground. However, in a year, the Earth as a whole, there is something like 150 billion tons of primary production on Earth in a year. That is a lot, all right? But we need to go one step farther than that. If this is the primary production, that just tells us how much energy the autotrophs actually make. However, we call this, or we can say this in terms of gross production. So that's the total energy made by producers. And a more useful number is what's called the net primary production. And that is when we take the gross primary production and we subtract from it what autotrophs, what the producers use for food. So they need some of that energy to keep themselves alive, and so we'll call that autotrophic respiration. And in some books you'll see autotrophic respiration referred to as capital R subscript A. So gross primary production doesn't take into account how much energy is reused by the plants. Net primary production, however, takes into account how much is used by the plants, which we call the autotrophic respiration. And we measure net primary production in joules per meter squared every year. So how much energy in joules is produced per unit area every year? All right? Or we can put it in terms of the grams of biomass per area every year. And so just to remind you that grams is like biomass of vegetation. Now what you shouldn't confuse this with, what you shouldn't confuse net primary production with, is what's called standing crop. And standing crop is how much mass of vegetation is in a specific area. Net primary production is only new biomass. So what do I mean? For example, redwood forest has very massive trees. There's a lot of standing crop, a lot of biomass. However, each year there might only be a small biomass that's actually added. So small primary production. In a grassland, because herbivores continually eat the grass and that it stays at a low level, there's not a lot of biomass in that area. However, each year a bunch of new grass plants or the grass population might proliferate extensively. In that case, it'll have a high or a low overall biomass or standing crop, but a high net primary production. So it's important to differentiate those two things. All right? Kind of the last thing on this train of thought, where net primary production can be stated kind of in the amount of new biomass, we also have something called net ecosystem production. And so this idea, it comes off of net primary production. And what we're going to talk about for net ecosystem production is we're going to take our gross primary product and we're going to subtract from it now the respiratory needs of not just producers, but for consumers too. So the respiratory need of producers and consumers. So animals eat some of the crops and they use that to continue surviving. Net ecosystem production is how much energy is left over when we take out the animal share and the plant share to keep surviving that can actually be used to grow the ecosystem. And this number is really important for ecologists because it determines whether an ecosystem is gaining carbon or losing carbon. So for example, if a forest might be producing a lot of carbon, but on the same time, a lot of animals in that same environment might be eating the plants and respiring out a lot of carbon. Even though it's producing a lot of carbon, its net ecosystem production might be low. Alright, the last thing that we're going to do is talk about net primary production in aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So primary production in aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems. So firstly, in aquatic, the main limiting factor in aquatic ecosystems is nutrients, nutrient availability. Things like phosphorus, things like nitrogen, dissolved oxygen. So areas in the world that have the highest aquatic primary production have plentiful phosphorus, nitrogen, and oxygen resources. Think about like a eutrophied lake where there's a lot of mosses and things growing. Those are also probably pretty rich in these nutrients. That's also why runoff from fertilizers from cropland, things like that, overutilization of even lawn fertilizer is dangerous because they increase. So runoff increases these nutrients that goes then into lakes, and the water becomes eutrophied, Microorganisms like phytoplankton began to multiply, use up a lot of oxygen, kill a lot of aquatic species. So in the aquatic environment, the limiting factors for primary production is nutrients, phosphorus, nitrogen, oxygen, things like that. In terrestrial, the limiting factors are a little bit more intuitive. So they're water and there's sunlight. So areas like tropical rainforest, a lot of both, high primary productivity. Areas like deserts, not a lot of water, low primary productivity. Areas, for example, far away from the equator, like in Alaska, low primary productivity, not a lot of light there either sometimes. So in this way, we can kind of establish primary production with different environmental factors, and we can use that to guess how much available energy there is in a given ecosystem. And the more given energy, the more animal diversity, the larger the ecosystem will be, the more biomass it can support. That's why the tropics seem to support such a wide and lush diversity of organisms. It's because of the available energy. There's more available sun energy to increase primary production there than most other places. Besides, some of the very nutrient-rich ocean waters, maybe close to Australia and stuff, the rainforests have the highest primary production of anywhere on Earth, and that is because they have some of the highest inputs of energy, the least limiting resource. They have a lot of water, a lot of sunlight. Right. Next time we'll be getting a hand at measuring and experimenting with primary production and gross and net production in our primary production lab. But until then, if you have any questions, just let me know.